Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Shirtless Plantain Show, the soccer edition. This is your host, Mitch. As always, I am here with Mateus. Hi, Mateus. How are you?
I'm doing well, Mitch. I'm doing well. A little muggy in Boston, but we're doing okay.
And Emily is, as always, here with us as well.
Hi, I'm doing well. I'm sad the NWSL is on a break, but I'm excited for international soccer.
Yeah, I mean, it's on a break for a good reason. We've got the Olympics. This is not a normal episode of the soccer edition because we have a special guest with us. We have Jeff Rueter from The Athletic. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me. This is great. I don't do podcasts much anymore.
They've just got you behind the computer.
Right. Yeah.
Coming out of retirement.
Exactly. Like I've just got the typewriter and I send it into headquarters and it takes 4 days and they review it. It's why all of our coverage is so we don't do gamers. It'd be a mess if we did typewriter gamers. But anyway, thanks for having me. This is awesome.
It's the most popular sports writing website, and they're still doing fax machines over at Athletic. So we're getting a little bit of a peek behind the hood. That's what they've got going over there. New York Times is very bare bones over there. Well, let's get right into it. The Shirtless Plantain Show released a aftermath podcast after the U.S. went out of Copa America. Mateus made a cameo on it. I was buffering my way through it. I was drinking a Modelo. And I was thinking that we maybe have a little bit, another conversation with maybe some more level heads than after we just lost to Uruguay. So now it's a week on. We've been seeing many of posts by the most normal U.S. men's national team fans trying to get rid of Greg Berhalter. I want to throw to you first, Jeff. How are you feeling as a U.S. men's national team fan about like the place that the team is in right now?
Yeah, it's I've actually been talking about this with a few friends. Clearly not in front of a podcast, Mike. Let me reassure you that I can't think of the last. Usually, when I think about the U.S. men's national team and World Cups in particular, Copa America 2016 as well, usually it's just like either they met my expectations. They seem to overperform like what I could have thought they would have done, or this tournament. The one example where I can sit here and think totally just like underwhelming, underperformed. It's like this in the 2006 World Cup at a time when like the FIFA rankings were getting exposed for having such like wonky calculus that the US was like a top 6, top 8 side in the world. This is it. This is kind of the nadir at that point because we thought that the players would be in a better spot than they were in December of 2022, right? We assumed that the players really wanted Greg Berhalter back. And I think we assumed that because they didn't want that like transition period to a new coach where you have to learn a new system, figure out each other's roles. And the reality that I'm sitting here with is maybe they just wanted him back because they felt safe. Because they felt like they could have club seasons where they were playing 270 or fewer minutes and they would get called into the Copa America without any sort of question about if there's, they were probably, of the 26 guys who were called into that roster, and we'll throw Serginho Dest in here too, because he absolutely would have been on that roster if he wasn't hurt. There were really only 5 or 6 spots that still felt up for grabs. Right. I've started to do all of these like tournament squad previews for The Athletic where I'll go in the weeds with the data and just kind of quick profiles for people who don't follow these players at their clubs all the time. And I actually started working on it in March and had like 20 players on the document, and all of them, except for Serginho Dest, were like in. And then I was updating the figures and all that sort of stuff too. But it felt complacent. It felt like players were playing safe. It felt like players assumed that they would finish second in the group. And that's when the tournament kicked off. And, I went to one of the 3 group games. I went to the one in Atlanta against Panama, and just, you could kind of sense that they didn't know how to react after the Balogun goal. Like that was it. That was the whole plan that they had to get over Tim Weah's red card. And after that, it was just like, well, we've done our part. And it's just that complacency, that inability to play to the sum of the parts. It's just so incredibly frustrating to see.
Yeah, I think the point about safety, I think, is a really interesting one, and one that struck me when we rehired Berhalter, because it was like it was very clear during his first tenure that like he's not like a level raiser manager of the U.S. men's national team, but he was like a guy that a lot of the players liked, and part of that is probably because it was safe. He was a safe choice for the federation because they knew that they had like a baseline of what to expect out of the team because of like where the team had gone after hiring him in 2018, that he was hired at such a low time that at that point it was only up from there. And now it's a second tenure and you have to build on it. And it's looking like he failed to do that in a major tournament. Mateus?
Well, not to play devil's advocate here too harshly, but like, who do you call into the roster that's going to make a big difference at the bottom of the roster, right?
Well, he dropped out. That's not good. Anyway, Jeff, how do you feel about like obviously after such a disappointment in Copa America, there's been I think a rightful thing from fans to want Greg Berhalter out. I think the way that a lot of fans have gone about it has been very grating for me to see. But how do you feel in terms of like, what do you think his job security actually looks like within U.S. soccer? And do you want him out? Do you want to change a voice? And a third part of this question, who would your ideal candidate be?
Yeah. I will echo the bit that I heard of Mateus's answer that I actually agree with, which is the player pool doesn't look as deep as we thought. And I think that when you look at the backs part, like just kind of the squad guys, these are the guys that U.S. men's national team Twitter usually like gets incensed over, right? It's the idea that Jordan Morris can make a World Cup roster, or Christian Roldan, right? It's the idea that the third goalkeeper is the most important pick because it signals a coach's intent, right? And I think the reality is there isn't a backup right back who is of like a high level international caliber beyond Serginho Dest. I think unfortunately we figured that out in this tournament. And so I think you do need a coach who is nimble and has a second system. Berhalter didn't really work off of anything but a 4-3-3 after that disastrous first half against Honduras in qualifying, where they tried to play with a back five and it just did not work at all. And it was pretty clear he just didn't have like a plan B. And so I think you need a coach who is willing to work with the players he has on hand. I think you do need a fresh voice, in my opinion, to get more out of these players, because I think that a lot of them beyond Christian Pulisic kind of were exposed for complacency. Again, as you look about feeling secure in the roster and feeling secure in your spot, not just making the 26 for this tournament, but starting. I think a lot of players could kind of assume that because of their experience in qualifying, their experience in the Nations League, not as much the Gold Cup, I suppose, but that they had those spots locked down in his lineup. So I think you'd need someone to shake it up. I mean, my ideal candidate who would be available after the Olympics would be Hervé Renard. I think that if you're looking for who's your next coach, you don't want someone who's going to need 4 years, a full 4-year cycle to get their vision executed, because you just don't have that time. So you want someone who is used to coming in, entering a team too close to tournaments as he often does, but now actually give him the benefit of a runway of 2 years, right? And yes, you're going to be playing friendlies against CONCACAF competition or opponents who are from different parts of the world that aren't high levels of Europe, South America, Asia, Africa, right? So you've already got a little bit of a disadvantage because of FIFA's schedule and being one of just 3 countries that doesn't have to qualify for the World Cup. And so everyone else is busy doing that thing. Renard doesn't need that. he can, really clear eyes come in and assess. I mean, just France looked like it was going to be an absolute mess at the World Cup last summer, right? I think that a lot of people went and they assumed that because of the resignation, there were players who were already kind of threatening to quit the program altogether. And like, look, at the end of the day, I don't think they're going to see a quarterfinal run as like magnifique. But I think that they'll look at it and say, this wasn't a disaster. We kept crucial players in the pool. We kept players at a high level. And I think that you can have a similar sort of galvanizing effect where maybe he is the coach who can actualize this pool and get them to a quarterfinal on home soil. And I think at this point we were talking about semifinal looks realistically ambitious. I think now that that's step back in my mind, right? I don't see it. This is not a World Cup semifinal pool of players right now. So yeah, I think Hervé Renard is the guy who could do the most with the players while also adapting to the faults of the program and the pool.
Yeah, I think that is he's probably my realistic pick as well, because I think I think that we need a voice outside of U.S. soccer. For one, I think there's going to be if the federation does move on from Greg Berhalter, we're gonna hear names like Steve Cherundolo and some other coaches that have been around MLS.
Mhm.
And I think someone like Hervé Renard, who has a lot of really quality experience both on the men and women's side, managing international rosters. He won against Argentina with Saudi Arabia. In the World Cup, like that in itself is like top of the resume kind of stuff, and is like a prime example of I'm able to do less or do more with less.
Mhm.
And I think that there's been like CONCACAF has maybe blinded us a little bit, and I think it's normal. I said this after like the reaction podcast after the game is I think it's very normal for fans of club, country, or whatever to overrate your players. Like you have these players, you have an emotional connection with these players, and you want your team to be good. You are going to overrate them in your mind. But I do think that CONCACAF has maybe been a bit of a blinder for U.S. fans because we've been so good in CONCACAF recently. And obviously, Mexico's been on a little bit of a downturn. So it's like they were our biggest rivals, and we've kind of had their number within the last 5 years. So it's like, okay, so we have this litmus test of where we should be. And maybe it wasn't accurate. Maybe it was giving us some wrong results because I always saw Copa America as a really good testing point and a really good opportunity to show like what we are. And obviously it did not go that way. Like we showed what we are in the completely wrong direction. So it's now like oh shit, is this team as good as we thought they were? I still do think this is a very talented team. There's a reason that all these players are playing in top 5 leagues in Europe. Obviously, some are struggling for minutes, and there's different situations here and there. But like we have a lot of quality players that are starting for our national team that the expectation of, at the very least, getting out of the group stage of Copa America was not met. Like, absolutely not. And in a tournament that we were hosting. And now it's, oh shit, we got to strap in for the biggest tournament in the world that we're hosting in 2 years. And what are we going to do? So do you think CONCACAF has been a little bit of a blinder for us in a way?
Emily, do you want to take this one or should
Well, I'd say yes, obviously, because Mexico has been so bad and it's made us feel really good that every time we beat them. What was the statistic that Mexico is the only like top whatever country that we've actually beaten?
Right.
But we've beaten them so many times that it kind of inflated our sense of ourselves. The question I was going to ask to you, Mitch, was in that podcast where you guys were, reeling a bit. You felt that Greg was still going to be on the touch line. Do we still feel like there's any possibility that he could still be the coach? That U.S. soccer is just going to be like, it's fine. We're going to stick with what we know.
I really don't know. Like, my gut right now says that, yeah, if like there's been federations that have moved a hell of a lot quicker than we have after an embarrassing tournament. Like the Ivory Coast fired their manager mid-tournament during AFCON, a tournament they were hosting and were underperforming, and then they went and won the tournament. So there have been federations that have moved way quicker than the U.S. have. And maybe they are waiting for their options. Maybe they are like Hervé Renard, who Jeff and I just talked about, isn't going to be available until after the Olympics. So like maybe it is waited a little bit, but you're not getting any benefits from like waiting. Like all you're doing is, I think, maybe just like upsetting an already like riled up base that I don't think is gonna stop. Like this is a furious U.S. men's national team fan base to where it's annoying.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be surprised if Greg is still the manager in 2026. I feel like just because of like how much faith the players and the federation truly put their necks out by hiring him again. Like that. It was a risky move to hire him again, even though it like was the safe move, because he was not like a super popular manager within the fan base. And then you have a tournament like this, and who knows what's going to happen. But I hope for a change. I hope for a new voice. I think, especially with like the players need someone who's going to push them, and that's not Greg Berhalter. And that has become abundantly clear. Let's move on now to, we've mentioned the Olympics a couple times, but we haven't actually talked about the U.S. Women's National Team's roster at the Olympics yet on this podcast. I think something we could say across the board for both the men and women at the Olympics is these rosters are too damn small. 18 players is not enough, especially for tournaments that move this quickly, where it's just game after game after game, and you only have 18 players at your disposal. I think the biggest talking points within the women's roster, because I don't know if there was all that many surprises. We, on this podcast, have been talking about Alex Morgan kind of being a bubble player for a long time. And I think ultimately because of the size of the roster is why she didn't make it. I think if we have a normal 26-player roster, I think Alex Morgan definitely makes the team. But it feels to me very much like the Landon Donovan in 2014 not making the men's roster for the World Cup, because it's like the player that people who aren't following the team super closely know. So it's going to be like all of these different like news sources that don't follow soccer that are like, oh, the U.S. Women's National Team's roster's out. Wait, Alex Morgan's not on it. We've got to do something about this. I'm assuming that both of you guys are with me on that, where it's not totally surprising that Alex didn't make it.
There was just like slight surprise just because it is Alex Morgan, but then you watch, it became very glaring in the past few months watching her club form that this is not someone who you can take to the Olympics with this size roster. And really, what's the point of taking her as an alternate? Like, that's not something she's going to want to do. It's more beneficial to have Lynn Williams there, even though, like, I feel like she humbled herself even to be like, okay, I'll come as an alternate as well. So, no, that wasn't a surprise. And I don't think there were any other surprises except for maybe, like, one setting into reality, like, okay, they're actually taking her to an Olympics, which we can touch on if...
Yeah, I know what you mean. I get the Donovan Morgan comparison. I think you're right for like 90% of US fans who watch US soccer only in major tournaments. That is going to be a very surprising omission. I think that the surprise was really just that whole like kind of settling in of reality, right? It was just like, this is what the numbers say we should do. This is what the eye test says, right? Alex Morgan at the W Gold Cup and at the She Believes Cup was not nearly as impactful for the U.S. as even last summer. And there were issues with Vlatko Ball, but like she was doing a lot of that, like, I will draw fouls. I will be like absolutely just absorbing the brunt of opponent's contact and drawing those fouls to get free kicks to get us to help advance up the field. Like, thankless work. But she wasn't even really doing much of that. I think I remember the Colombia game, her best stuff was off ball running and decoy runs in the central channel that helped free up space for like Trinity Rodman on the right. So that's not a player you really look to bring into a tournament. Positional versatility, you know, as you both alluded to with the 18 player cap, like you just need players who can play multiple roles. Like, I mean, look at the forwards. I mean, Swanson and Smith and Rodman kind of picked themselves as the starters. Jaden Shaw can play in the midfield. She can play on either wing, and Crystal Dunn can play everywhere but goalkeeper. So like, I mean, who are you really dropping unless you decide Crystal Dunn's a midfielder? I think when Meg Linehan, Steph Young, and I were making our projections throughout, we were 17 of 18 with our final one. And the only difference is we had Alex going and we had Corbin Albert staying back. And we assumed that was a little of positional redundancy. We assumed that Emma Hayes would see Crystal Dunn as more of a midfielder. So then it's like, okay, you don't necessarily need another number 8. And so you might as well bring Alex Morgan just for the experience. And that this would sort of double as a last major tournament for her. And then you spend the next 3 years figuring out who can be Sophia Smith's backup for 27. But wheels in motion. It's the Emma Hayes era and a fresh coach. I mean, like we were saying with the men, fresh coach sometimes is needed to help turn over members of the pool.
And if only Emma had gone your way, in my heart. You know?
Let's talk about the Corbin Albert selection, because that's the other controversial part of this roster. And I do think that most of the controversy of her being picked is because of her controversy with her online actions, which I think is completely understandable for a like fan base like the U.S. Women's National Team is very diverse, and particularly the LGBTQ plus community. I completely understand an aversion to Corbin Albert, but I think from just like a soccer perspective, I do think it makes sense to bring her because she's like a lot of the alternatives, unless you saw like Crystal Dunn as a midfielder, I haven't really played much in the team. Like Corbin Albert has played with the national team and has like played under Emma Hayes. So like at the very least you have like that familiarity. And I understand that there's a rebuttal that she hasn't played particularly well lately. I imagine the off-field stuff had something to do with it. I can't imagine that didn't have an impact. But I understand why it's a controversial choice. But I think from a soccer perspective, she's in like kind of a position of need because she's someone that's played as a 6 for her club. And outside of Sam Coffey, I don't know if the national team has like a true number 6. So she's someone that like can fill in there and then also can play further forward, which just like Jeff was saying with the positional versatility in an 18-player roster, you need players like that. But I know you're going to disagree with me, Emily.
I have to say, I don't care who we would bring as long as it wasn't Corbin Albert. I think that what she did should be disqualifying anyway. And I think U.S. Soccer should have a code of conduct, and they probably do. I don't know. Does it exist? They should hold high standards. We can give her grace and time to learn and grow or whatever. But during that time, she doesn't have the right to be wearing the U.S. Soccer crest. She can do that on her own time and, prove publicly that she's done that. I think the big issue with fans is that there has been no public, repentance or whatever. There's just been nothing at all. Her apology, even at the beginning, did not directly address what the online activity was. So I think in order for what Emma Hayes was asking all of us, which I honestly found those statements to be kind of insulting to the fan base, and hurtful when she said she's a tremendous human. The fans should really embrace her. She's been struggling, turned her kind of into the victim where, like, let's talk about the community that she harmed. And I still can't get over the tweet where she celebrated and kind of wished harm upon Megan Rapinoe. Like, that's like actual direct to, a human being that you can name. So this is how I feel. I'd take Hal Hirschfeld. I'd take Andy Sullivan. I would take Jalen Howell. I would take anybody because I don't think Corbin Albert is going to be the one that's the X factor here.
Yeah, and I think that then if you're looking like one as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, not a great day of work. Not a great week of work when all of that dropped, because then it wasn't just report on news, but it was report on news while also reading somebody's hateful sentiments about the community of which you are a part. So yeah, like that's one I'll never forget. It's like when Gio Reyna's parents were like kind of like brought out into the public light after the World Cup, like that similar sort of like, I remember where I was because I never left my desk for 4 days. And I think that, to Emily's point, we haven't seen the work. And part of this is it has to be done. If it was done in a performative, like if they found a sponsor to like give like monthly like TikToks that she is describing the work she's doing, that would be off, right?
That'd be we're not... I'm picturing the boys universe when you talk like that.
I was gonna say, like, I mean, the sponsors are actually like fantastic. The potentials for this, and yeah, there's totally a template with the boys, but like, it doesn't track, and honestly it's not going to be enough for everybody. So I also understand to an extent saying that this work has to be done in private for it to be the most genuine that it can be. And so you want to hope when a new coach comes in and says, actually fans, you're being pretty harsh, she's gone through enough, hasn't she? That's a very bold choice. And that's certainly a sort of stick to soccer sort of sentiment. I mean, you've listed 3 of the potential alternatives, Hirschfeld being one of the alternates on the roster, Andy Sullivan being a World Cup veteran. Jalen Howell, someone who hasn't really gotten a chance, but was seen alongside Sam Coffey as like that next wave to take over when Sullivan and to a lesser extent Julie Ertz were not involved in the midfield. I thought Lily Johannes was actually kind of earmarked for that spot.
She like showed up. She showed up Colburn Albert in like the 10 minutes that she played at the Gold Cup.
She looked composed. She looked incredibly savvy positionally. She already had some of those like relationships off field. Certainly you could see it with the celebration to her goal, but also on field, you could see the passing chemistry already being worked in real time. So like, to say nothing about the cap tying potential of bringing her to the tournament and playing her for exactly 1 minute, right? And I think that the idea is that you can't afford to bring a player for 1 minute, right? And so Emma Hayes must have looked and said, we don't really have more than 20 minutes for Lily Johannes at this tournament if we don't, if we play the minimum number of games. So all of that calculus, like Mitch said, who else? And the reality is that Corbin Albert played a lot under Twyla Kilgore, and the assumption in hindsight can be that was Emma Hayes wanting her to be ready, Corbin Albert to be ready for this moment, a player that she thought very highly of from her time with Paris Saint-Germain. It's going to be a big check on where she fits into the locker room chemistry, because I know that it's taking a place an ocean away, but it will come through whether or not she's actually done the work to regain trust and relationship with her teammates or not. Sadly, that's kind of the biggest question right now with this roster, isn't it?
I do have to say in regard to that, it comes to question the collective culture because, Trinity Rodman did an interview in Vogue where, and it's not on Trinity to speak to, what Corbin's done at all. But, she characterized this as, just having strong opinions, which worries me a little bit about where the vibes are in this team or where the leadership is on this kind of stuff. Right. Trinity is young as well. So she doesn't need to take responsibility for this, but as a question.
Right. I mean, like 5 years ago, if this had happened, probably not on the team anymore. We've seen this with Jalen Hinkle, right? But also, like, I think that you would look and you would say, okay, Tobin, Kristen, Megan, Becky, like a lot of players where it's like they're going to sit down and they're going to kiki and they're going to like talk through what this means and not just like, hey, don't do that because you were the main character on X for a day. Right. Like, and you just don't know. I mean, at this point, who the leaders are, right? Like you would assume that, like Alyssa Nair doesn't necessarily seem like the like sit down and have extended conversations about something off the field, right? Whatever the case is, person. Casey Kruger has been in and out of the program, so she isn't as much of a known entity, which means then you're going to, Crystal Dunn, Lindsay Horan, Emily Sonnet, like the next three most veteran members. And so who's sitting her down, taking her under her wing? Probably Lindsay Horan as captain face of the program currently based on how they market. Similar position to say, like I get it. I understand being around European soccer, whatever the case is, where maybe there's a little bit more connective tissue there. But to Emily's point, you just don't know. You don't know who it is who would be having those conversations with her. And sometimes that's very concerning, especially coming off of a team that I think a lot of fans felt they knew very well over the last 8-10 years.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation. And I think like fans are rightfully upset to not see the work. But like you said, no one wants to see a weekly TikTok series sponsored by Truly of Corbin's journey to allyship. Like no one gives a shit about that. And and it's performative and disingenuous to do something like that. And so it's like a really hard line to find. And honestly, having players that like would say the kind of work that was to be done, like if this had happened years ago when all of those players were still on the team, I think that if Corbin was still being called up, you would have someone like Megan Rapinoe that'd be like, yeah, we put her through a boot camp of allyship, and like it's like, okay, well that sounds good.
Who do you trust?
But we don't really have anything like that. We don't like. There's not a window that we can peer in, and there's not a window that isn't disingenuous. So we just kind of have to take everyone's word for it. We just kind of have to take Emma's word for it, and I guess Trinity's word for it, because she's the only other person that's spoken on it, of just like she's doing the work. What work? We kind of don't know. But She's part of this roster, and it'll be interesting to see how that gels. Moving to the men's side of the Olympics, that roster was announced this week. Just like the women, the most controversial things about the roster were the players not picked. The biggest name of which being Diego Luna of Real Salt Lake. And then obviously for me, Cole Bassett, I felt like was a very big omission as well. There's 3 overage players on this team: Miles Robinson, Walker Zimmerman, and Jordy Mihailovic representing the Colorado Rapids. Let's go. I think that there's a lot of talk about the players that are going to be missing from this team, but I also think that there's an interesting conversation to have, in parallel with the senior men's team of this roster is not as good as a lot of other teams going to the Olympics. France is a player that just got sold to Bayern Munich for $50 million, who's going to be starting for them, and Michael Elise. And our best player is probably Taylor Booth, around there. So it's a little bit concerning when it comes to the outlook of this team. But what do you think, Jeff, as you've kind of I'm assuming you've put together a big list of Olympic hopefuls as well for the men in your work for the Athletic.
Yeah. There certainly was that sort of center back picks made sense when you looked at the pool, right? I think Jalen Neal was kind of the obvious center back option from the Galaxy, but then he missed first few months of the season, so then some players coming off injury, that's a harder pick. So makes sense to go with Zimmerman and Robinson. Their clubs would release both of them, which is helpful. They've been around the senior team, but they've also played as a partnership in a back four. So you benefit so much from that veteran bedrock and chemistry, and neither of them is 36, 37 years old where you can't play them every single game. So those picks made sense. Mihailovic has had a hell of a year. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Weird pick. Very weird pick by Marko Mitrovic. Because generally those 3 overage slots are kind of seen as admittance of the weakest parts of your nation's player pool in that age group. And so it's your cheat code, right? And so you can come in and you can say, we want 2 veteran center backs because we don't trust a single one of our youth to be the starting center back for the US U23s. Great. But attacking midfield? I mean, you're right. The 2 biggest omissions are in that role, playing regularly in the same league as Mihailovic, one on the same team, both in the same rivalry. So it's why would you prioritize that? Unless you're going to try to do some really weird system things where you're going to play him as a false 9, so you need a veteran who reads the game differently. The reality is, Mihailovic kind of took the spot most of us had assumed was going to go to a second striker. And so it's, it went, especially once Ricardo Pepi went, it's okay, that's Brandon Vasquez's spot, right? Or maybe Josh Sargent, Norwich is going to let him take a few extra weeks with his recovery to do that with U.S. Soccer overseeing it instead of them. Much more speculative. PSV was never going to let Ricardo Pepi go, but it seemed like Brandon Vasquez was the guy for that. And then you could have him and Duncan Maguire, just kind of reliving the glories of the 2023 Eastern Conference, I guess. But instead, what you have is 1 striker. You have an attacking midfielder who pushed 2 players out, one of whom has dual national eligibility. Forgive me if I forgot Cole Bassett might have it.
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. But
he's from Colorado. He's
right.
He's fully from here, unless he's pulling great grandpa's Croatian ancestry or something.
Right,
he's an American
passport. Yeah, something like that. So less of a culture issue if the senior team rates Bassett, but Diego Luna, with the issues that Mexico is publicly having in creative areas, wouldn't you be in his ear immediately? Right. So there's just very, very strange one. The rest of it, I'm with you. Such different tournaments between the women and the men because of the age restrictions. And so I think you look at the US women, and even in that condensed field, you look and say that they still should be among the favorites to medal. I'd be very surprised if the US makes it to the semifinal round of this. And that's okay. They haven't even qualified for this tournament since 2008. So anything that they do in Petty is gravy. But, a couple of very, very strange picks that really overshadow a very good central midfield, really encouraging depth at goalkeeper in the wake of the situation we've seen with the senior side. Good talent on the wing. Like, we're not talking about any of that. I'm not interested in talking about any of that right now. Like, I'm just very confused by those top end picks, particularly Mihailovic over Bassett and Luna.
Yeah, I think the Bassett one's interesting because, like, obviously you've got guys like Jack McGlynn and Ben Kremenowski, who are both playing well for their club, and they're both very, very young. They're both, like, still teenagers. Like, Cole Bassett has been better than both of them this season and played more, and has often been played in a deeper role. Like, I think 90% of Cole's games this year has not been as a 10. It's been more of a 6 and a double pivot next to either Connor Ronan or Ollie. And he's been really, really excelling in, like, that kind of all actions kind of role. But then also in games like we saw this week against St. Louis, Jordy wasn't playing because of a or yellow card suspension, and Cole played the 10 and was just everywhere. And he, like, similarly, like we're talking about with the women, when you got an 18-player roster, if you have a player that can play comfortably as a 6 in a double pivot, an 8, or as a 10, I don't know why you wouldn't take them. Regardless of, like, he's on the older age of the U23 part or anything like that. I feel like I feel very, very bad for Cole to miss out. And in the little video that the Rapids put out when Jordy was, like, it was announced to the team that he got selected, even he was like, I'm so honored to do this. Like, my age group failed to do this, so it's rare to get a second chance. I'm honored to be, like, on this roster. But I'm really upset that Cole didn't make it. I think that he's been working his ass off and, like, fully deserved to make this team. And which I thought was, like, a really nice, like, show of appreciation to a teammate that's been working really hard for this opportunity, and I'm upset that he didn't get it. And if the U.S. lose Diego Luna to Mexico, we deserve to lose Diego Luna to Mexico. I genuinely think that he is a guy that should be closer to making the first team than he is to not making the U23 roster, because of just how he's played. That I don't care that he's playing in MLS. He should be close to making the first team and not fully off the U23s. I frankly don't know why. Because he seems like a great character, great player, and it would suck if the U.S. end up losing him, which at this point we're taking him for granted, and we kind of deserve to. Let's move on now to we're going on an Olympic break for the NWSL. So for the next few weeks we got no NWSL, so it's a good time to look back at the first part of the season and talk about the league as a whole. I feel like we're very granular on the show, talking about games week to week. So we're going to talk about the just how the league is going right now. And at the top of the table, which I guess does relate to the games that happened this week, is Orlando and KC, because KC had their first loss of the season to Orlando, and we're very petty about how Orlando celebrated. But I think we could say declaratively is these two teams are forces to be reckoned with and are very, very, very good. Emily, I'm going to throw to you. What are your thoughts on Orlando and KC going forward? Are they going to be our top two fighting for the Shield the rest of the season?
I was going to say, like, petty maybe about how Orlando celebrated, but I think Kansas City left an even worse taste in my mouth in how they were, like, acting like they did in fact lose a championship. But yeah, I think Orlando and Kansas City will be the two, like, behemoths fighting at the top, where I think Washington Spirit is a dark horse, honestly, with some of the things that they have coming up, some signings that they were making. But just talk about Orlando, I think they showed, like, the hunger and the passion. Of course, this is in the context of historically being really bad as a team. But I think Marta, with her displays, shows how much this means with her, career in its, end stages. This is her last international season, her last Olympics, TBD on her professional career. But I think this could be a bit of an Ali Krieger effect in that this team is fighting for Marta, and they have an incredible X factor in Barbara Banda, who showed that just, like, she can make something happen out of absolutely nothing. And Seb Hines has developed, these players who are not big names by any means, out of, like, a Summer Yates, Carrie Bello, I'm missing another of the trio, but they're young players who have made this like a real team. Whereas I see maybe Kansas City as, another super monster with all these other egos, perhaps. You do have a Davinia on top of a Chewinga. And yeah, I think that's do you have anything on the Pride?
I do think it's interesting something you tweeted last week, which
Yeah,
was that Orlando has passed San Diego's point total from last season. And the team that won the Shield, it had just got their points passed halfway through the season, is kind of an insane stat. And Jeff, I want to throw to you about these teams, about Kansas City and Orlando. Has the ceiling of NWSL potentially raised with players like Barbara Banda and Chewinga coming to the league and just coming in, lighting the league on fire? We're seeing these two teams that had not lost until July. That is in itself insane. So has the ceiling kind of changed, do you think, in NWSL?
I think so. And I think it's just more sophisticated scouting, more sophisticated recruiting, I think they probably saw, the whole who's going to be the first $1 million player debate happening without any NWSL club really being involved in the conversation throughout, let's say, 2023. And probably like, why aren't we? Right? Because I think that the idea has always been the U.S. women's national team is going to have most of its members. I think, in 2023, only one player wasn't playing in the NWSL on Vlatko's roster. So the idea was okay, that is going to make it a strong league. And then they're going to be able to recruit wisely, like Yuki Nagasato and Marta, and be able to get in very good players. But as Europe continued to advance, as the Women's Super League continued to grow and grow in England, and the Champions League became more obviously prominent to the clubs that participate in it beyond 4 or 6 of them. I think that it sort of lit a fire under the NWSL. What do you want to be? Do you want to be the MLS of women's soccer? Which, no. Or
and we're not.
And they're not, right? It is players have credibly said that it is like a Champions League game every single week, and every single game is, even if you're playing against a team like Utah or Seattle or Houston, looking at the bottom of the table this season, it's a challenge. There are players on those rosters who would be starting on others that are much higher up the table. So I think that the level has improved. I think that the ambition of ownership groups, to their credit, has improved to make sure that they aren't getting passed by. I think they've realized that treadmill keeps moving, which is good and necessary. I think that when you talk about the possible Ali Krieger effect of Marta, I think there's also a benefit. This is probably the first year where you wouldn't say she was the best player on Orlando's roster. And how freeing. Yeah, go ahead. Is it Alex
I was just
Morgan
gonna say she just seems so much more engaged this season. And I don't know if that's Banda has created space for her, to play her game. But it's a totally different Marta than you've seen in the NWSL probably ever.
Totally. She doesn't have to be the primary scoring option, which means that then opponents now are like, where's Barbara? We have to follow Barbara Banda, right? So she has more space to set up her dribble, and that caters to where she's at in her career, right? She's not going to be able to make that sort of sprint behind a back line with nearly the same regularity or effectiveness. So I think that that's been huge. I think that you see sort of a dependability in terms of Kansas City, where this is the system that they want to play, whereas I think Orlando is more opportunistic. So I think that if you were going to look at expected goal performances and all that sort of stuff, you would say Orlando maybe has room to regress. But then you look at the players on hand, it's where would they, right? And sure, it's maybe just games where Barbara Band is scoring 2 or 3, she's scoring 1 or 2, right? That's regression, but you can afford that usually. Kansas City, it would be on the other side of it. They've actually underperformed their XG, if you believe it. And so it's how do we get the ball to Chewinga more? How do we respond to Bia? What's her status for the rest of the season? How do you just kind of incorporate more different looks so that it doesn't become as predictable, which is something that, of course, the world learned last year about Vlatko Andonovski. If you spend enough time studying his system, you can usually catch up to it. So we'll see. There's the nuances with that. I'm with you on Washington as well, being sort of a dark horse. It's a weird time to make a coaching change given the form that they've been in as well. But that was planned. And so you hope it's kind of similar to what the US is expecting with Emma Hayes, which is that, it was Twyla, but it was all cohesive. So
yeah, I think I saw a video of when Jonathan Hurl just came in and was being welcomed. He said, I'm not changing anything.
yeah,
I'm just here to learn about, and like facilitate what you're already doing. And I think Adrian Gonzalez is also staying on staff, so very helpful. But perfect timing for them to make this little switch where you're going into an Olympic break, and he can have the Summer Cup to see these players and tweak whatever he wants. I was gonna say there was news today from Jason Anderson that they're gonna sign Ivory Coast international Rosamond Kouassi, who was on the radar of WSL clubs. So Michelle Kang, she is really putting her thumb on the scale here. And building a monster. Lacey Santos also still to come, which is crazy.
That's wild.
It's really crazy. So if all those pieces come together, like maybe not Shield, but crazy contenders in the playoffs, for sure. I think that maybe the defense is the question mark for the Spirit.
Before we move on to some of the teams that are toiling this season, we'd be remiss moving on without letting Emily talk about Gotham as our resident Gotham FC fan.
Gotham FC, super supporter. I would say I love the way that they're playing. Juan Carlos Amros has really established his way of playing. It's fun. It gets the best out of Rose Lavelle. I think Crystal Dunn has done really well. Obviously, there's less competition on those wings for her with a lot of the injuries going on, but that suits the U.S. Women's National Team very well right now that she's coming off, a lot of playing time and in good form. I'd say in this break, the one thing that I would want is another winger, without Midge. We don't really have someone who is like a take-on winger, one take-on artist. That's really been missing for me. I think Yasmin Ryan, who plays the wing a lot, she's probably more suited as a midfielder, like attacking midfielder. So I'd like to see that depth. I've heard that there's a WSL player that they might sign. I don't know. But
are you intentionally being vague, or is the report you saw vague?
my report's not coming from an actual reporter, so this is not official. This is just rumor mill among fans. I'll say and then the other big question mark is that we're sending 7 players to Paris. How are they going to come back? Roosevelt in particular, who has been super key for us. Hopefully, and she's quite injury prone. So she reminds me of, if anyone watched 30 Rock, the Emily Mortimer character who had avian bone syndrome.
Yeah, that's right.
her bones are very brittle. That reminds me of Roosevelt a lot. So hopefully they can wrap her up in some bubble wrap.
Have Roosevelt in some bubble wrap. Before we move on to MLS, Jeff, I want to throw to you about the floundering California teams. Obviously, the San Diego Wave made a coaching change. They have not won since the coaching change. So new manager bounce, kind of a myth for San Diego right now. And then Angel FC and I guess Bay FC is in the playoff line right now. But it's all been interesting seasons for all of them at the moment. And how do you kind of what's your take on how they've done so far and how you project them going forward?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, shout out to my Chicago Red Stars. Really good.
I didn't know that they were your club.
I didn't either.
The closest club to here, so it was either that or Kansas City. Well, Kansas City didn't even exist when I started covering the team, so
that's the struggle that I have. It was Kansas City's the closest team to me, but I feel no connection to Kansas City whatsoever. So I'm just waiting for Denver to get one.
yeah, that's the move. That's definitely the move. I mean, Chicago has kind of been no pun intended, the second city that I've always kind of had for sort of connection. So so I mean that's been trending much better for them. For Bay, finally kind of getting things together. Probably a really bad time for them to have this sort of a break, because I think that they would have loved to have forgotten the first third of their season. I would have loved to kind of live in the second. It looks a lot more like what people expected with all the signings that they made as well. So I think that's a credible playoff contender. I think that especially when you look at the teams like directly beneath them, which is Louisville and then the other two California clubs, like by points per game, like why not Bay? I think that if they can make the playoffs in their first year, that's a great achievement. And that's a realistic achievement for an expansion club. And then on the flip side of it, I think you get to San Diego and Angel City. And this is where sort of that good vibes of being a new club has worn off by the third year. And
the vibes are thin.
Vibes are bad. Vibes are not immaculate right now, because you look and it's like both have had to make coaching changes now. Both have one very rashly. Like I was surprised by the timing of the Casey Stoney dismissal, and I'm sure that, similar to what Emily was saying about Washington, you want to do it before you have the Olympic break so that they have time to get used to the new voice. But they're doing a proper coaching search. Like now. Yeah. So like you're not even going to have that with like if Paul Buckle was going to finish out the season, which it wouldn't make a ton of sense with the roster that they have. But you kind of figure out, do you have a culture? Do you have a bedrock where when, kind of the things have settled into the rhythm of this is what our club is, we can continue to perform to expectations, exceed them or miss them again. Right. And like, I continue to look at the players that San Diego has. This is where you're seeing Alex Morgan's, struggles in front of goal. This is who's feeling it more than the U.S. women's national team, right? She has been, since getting back from Australia and New Zealand, has been terrible value in front of goal based on the chances that she has been provided. Jaden Shaw has struggled to score compared to expectations from last year and from the start of 2024 with the national team. And with Angel City, it's just they feel forgotten, weirdly, in California, right? When mm-hmm. They're the third club of California soccer in terms of just like buzz. And that feels very strange, just given the launch that they had and how they seemed that was going to be the new gold standard for what a club should be. So, you look at that and you say, okay, Angel City has been underperforming expectations. You'd hope that they can make that back in terms of expected goals. And right now, I would guess 2 of the 3 will miss the playoffs. I would kind of struggle to see who else is falling off, because really 7 teams are at 1.4 points per game or higher, and then the rest of the league is 1.1 or lower. So there's a gap that's starting to grow, and I don't know where they make up that ground, unless a lot of players leave or get hurt from like Chicago and North Carolina in particular, and Bay, I suppose.
Also, Kevin Baxter reported today that in a article about Kristen Press, who hopefully
could be big, but what a long layoff, right? Like,
yeah,
you can't expect just like vintage Kristen Press. You have to what percentage of what we come to expect. Sorry.
As a fan, I just want to see her on the field.
Same.
I have absolutely no expectations for her. But in addition to Kristen Press possibly being able to play a bigger role, at all in the last 10 games, after getting some minutes in the Summer Cup, Kevin Baxter reported that they are making 2 significant signings, or they have 2 significant signings lined up, which in for Angel City standards, like could flop mm-hmm. because the roster that they've compiled thus far has been very like low caliber.
It's been underwhelming.
Very underwhelming. So let's see what they mean by significant. But
yeah, I do think that the most interesting one is San Diego's position, because they were so good last year and then went even more all in this season by mm-hmm. trading for Sanchez. So it'll be interesting to see how they can turn things around after the Olympic break. But it's been a tough start to the season for California. Let's move on to MLS, and we're gonna start in the Eastern Conference, and we're gonna talk about the top 4 teams. But I really think the top 3 teams in the Eastern Conference are like, no offense to your New York Red Bulls, Emily.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're really edging out the Red Bulls.
No offense to your New York Red Bulls, but at least to me, Cincinnati, Miami, and Columbus are like a head and shoulders, and in the same way in the Western Conference, where like the Rapids are 4th. But I think the LAFC, LA Galaxy, and RSL are a tier above them in terms of just caliber of team. And we saw it this week. Cincinnati and Miami played. Obviously, short-handed Miami, but it did not go well for Inter Miami. Their one Barca boy got sent off in Sergio Busquets. Uh-huh. And Cincinnati just kind of fully ran away with that game. And then we know how good Columbus is. But what do you think, Jeff, on like how the first half of the season has shaken out for the East?
Yeah, in the East, I think, I mean, look, that's probably a game Cincinnati's had circled on a schedule since like the schedule dropped. Like you can tell, right? Like this is our chance, and I'm sure that once they realize, and immediately they would have realized Copa America would still be going on. Argentina's not dumping out in the group stage, so like this is a chance for us to really like. That's a 6-point game that has such an outsized impact on the standings compared to the state of the Inter Miami team that took the field over the weekend. Like this is the story of Inter Miami in 2024 and probably in 2025 inevitably as well, because they'll have some of their young players like Diego Gomez are probably going to head out the door and they'll have to replace them quick, right? We're just like, if Messi is there, good luck. If Messi is not there, good luck Miami. Like that's it. That's the whole thing. And it's it goes to show just the outsized impact that a quality player like him can have. But they have been so beatable, so flawed when they don't have that bedrock of him, but also the younger South American players who are doing a lot of the running for him. And so I think that Cincinnati will look at that and say, like, this is a result that reinforces that the Shield is ours to lose, right? Because I think that a lot of people, I think I actually had Miami lower than they'll end up finishing in my predictions, but like a lot of people had Miami as like, of course they're going to run away and they're going to win every title, every trophy that the league has until Messi retires. So that was never going to happen. But you have Cincinnati now wanting to create separation from Columbus more and want to create separation from LAFC, which we'll get to in the West, where like if they want to keep the Shield, they need to not just win against Miami, but demoralize them, where they will then drop results, hopefully thereafter for another couple of weeks. So yeah, very good form for them to be in going into the League's Cup break. Another team that probably won't like that break is happening in the time that it will be happening in the schedule. I think a lot of teams are going to have complaints about when the League's Cup falls in the calendar in general, because it makes it such a dysfunctional, like disjointed season. And then Columbus, I mean, they're doing the pretty stuff again. They're attacking really well again. I think that I have yet. I don't like look. Obviously, no one questions Wilfried Nancy in MLS circles anymore. But like, there are certain players like Christian Ramirez where it's just they play better when he's on the field. So like, I don't understand why he isn't like a locked-in starter because of the relationship he has with Cucho. But they're in their right way again, and I think that those are the three teams you have to go through. Like Red Bulls have been further along in that sort of post everything has to be energy drink build out than I expected this year. This is kind of where I assumed they could have been next year. So that's a credit to Sandro Schwartz. That's a credit to Father of the Year Emil Forsberg. That's a credit to the Earth is Flat John Tolkien, right? Like they've had some very weird people, very weird locker room stories like come out of that, to say nothing about Dante Van Zier a year ago. So
wow, we're really
playing the hits here.
The weirdest team in MLS.
They are
great characters. Yeah,
they
over
are.
here.
Like you could write like a collection of short stories that would sell volumes, just off of like the stories of these Red Bulls. But it's been further along. It doesn't look like a fluke to me. It looks very sustainable. It's a game model that I think they can replicate week after week. Lewis Morgan coming back in the form he's been in has been so needed to have that sort of like a dependable like option B if as Emil Forsberg gets used to this league as well. So I know that they're very close in points to New York City because they are, but I do tend to think that they are closer to being in that contender tier than New York City is, or being closer to that contender tier than they are to the tier below them, which I guess you would start off as saying like New York City and Charlotte, and
yeah, I mean, well, they're not baseball merchants. They don't play all their games in baseball stadiums, so like that's helpful for the Red Bulls.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the Western Conference. And the top three teams, as I said, are LAFC, LA Galaxy, and Real Salt Lake. I feel like they have kind of all, shown that they are the three best teams in the Western Conference, and they're so close together. I think they're on the same points right now, or LAFC is like 3 points ahead of the other two. And it's just these three teams are all really quality. They all have some star power. Chicho Hernandez has been playing lights out. The LA Galaxy's new signings have been tremendous to start the year. And LAFC still has Denny Bouanga. As much as I want to hate on him, they're getting Olivier Giroud. They have a lot of like quality players. Like the Rapids, I have been so over the moon with how we've been this season. And we've been on such a fantastic run of late. Other than one blip against a team that is significantly better than us in LAFC, who absolutely played us off the field last week. But outside of that, it's like very clear that we are a tier 2 West team. But what do you think about the tier 1 West teams, Jeff, and how that potentially shakes out?
I actually don't think the Rapids are that far off.
I love hearing that.
Like, I almost have more faith that the Rapids could make a run to, let's say, the conference final than the Galaxy at this point. And I'm like, no flattery involved, that no team creates better chances than the Colorado Rapids. Colorado Rapids are number 1 in Major League Soccer in XG per shot, which just means that on average, they create their chances in the most fortuitous way. They are above Inter Miami. They're above the Galaxy, Columbus. Like, they're number 1. I think that you've seen in the Western Conference over the last 18 months, it has become the homeland for reclaimed ex-MLS head coaches. And you have like Pablo Mastroeni reinventing himself, right? And saying like, I don't have to be Colorado Rapids legend Pablo Mastroeni. Who am I as a coach? And doing some reflecting and not reacting to what ownership said that the team needs to be within the resources that they had, especially at the time, but figure out what he wants to do. And Joe Lowry wrote a fantastic piece over at Backheeled about that, his off season of further reinvention that I thought was very good. But then you look at, Ben Olsen getting his results in Houston as well. And it doesn't surprise me that Chris Armas would be kind of at a similar point where he had his little sojourn of being like a punching bag for the English media with Leeds and Man United, and then come back and say, okay, now it's time for me to do something that isn't just like, can you tell I'm from the coaching tree of Ralph Rangnick and Jesse Marsh and all of this sort of stuff, right? So that's been really encouraging to see. Giroud is going to really change. That's a player that Bouanga is going to have to respect. I've always had my issues with Bouanga in transition because I don't think he knows how to play with his head up anymore. I think that he has gotten it into his head and how he operates that like he is going to take the shot, right? Just kind of like Allen Iverson for the Sixers in the early 2000s of the NBA, where it's just like, you are setting this up for me to do what I want to do. And Carlos Vela, obviously, with that very infamous kind of throw of his arms against Inter Miami when Bouanga sent one to the moon when he was wide open for what would have been a pretty easy place shot past Drake Callender last fall. So Giroud is going to be someone who changes how they play. They're going to be able to hold up and not be as reliant upon transition, which is good for them. They're always better when they do have that sort of set play, not set pieces, but just like run of play without transition moments. So that's going to be big for them. I don't know. I think that the West is more competitive, weirdly, because I think that you do have more of that strong middle class of teams that actually could. And you're arguing that starts with Colorado. I guess I would argue that starts just below them. But that's where you get into the teams where it's like, okay, no one wants to face Vanni Sartini's Whitecaps in the playoffs because of Ryan Gold and Brian White. And if they get hot, it's really difficult to contain. The Portland Timbers have been overperforming a little bit, but like they have the support when things are going well in Portland. That is a very difficult team to play against. Houston is right there. Seattle is finding its way. Minnesota United has been doing better in the post-Adrian Heath era than I think a lot of people expected in year one. So like it's going to be a tricky bracket to figure out. Just a lot of these matchups are going to be, I think, a little closer than you'll see in the East, where I do agree it's a 3.5 team race right now for contention there. So that's fun. I don't know. I mean, that makes for fun soccer. And then to say nothing else about how it's the late game if you're on the East Coast, all the better. It's something that pairs very well with any liquor of your choosing.
Yeah, I will say that there's nothing I love more that someone that isn't biased about the Rapids saying that the Rapids are good. Like that makes me happy as a fan. That's like, okay, I don't have totally rose-tinted glasses on. Like, this is a good team.
It's a huge complex.
Yeah. One thing I do have to say about the Rapids, and like relates to the game that we just played this weekend against St. Louis, the vibes have never been higher. Like, this team is like fucking loves Chris Armas. They will run through a wall for that guy.
Yeah.
If like all you have to do is look at the reaction to Darren Yappy scoring his first MLS goal to know what the vibes are like for the Colorado Rapids right now. That kid has been working so hard for 3 years now. He finally gets his goal, and the entire team looked like they scored. And it like Chris Armas was in the dog pile, like celebrating that goal.
Yeah.
Like that alone is just like, yeah, I'm gonna rewatch that on repeat. Like I fucking love this team to just Kevin Cabral had a goal and an assist against St. Louis. Like he learned how to play soccer. That's crazy. Like and maybe that just means St. Louis is really bad because Jonathan Lewis also had a goal and assist. So I'm taking that with a grain of salt. But like it's really fun to have a really good team in Colorado. Like I'm really excited looking forward. Like I think I'm gonna be at a Colorado Rapids playoff game. We're like the one nice thing about a 3-game playoff series is that it guarantees your team will have a playoff game if you make the playoffs, which as a fan is lovely because it means you get to go to a game. And I'm more over the moon that I will get to go watch the Colorado Rapids in the playoffs this season. But a big thing that Chris Armas laid out at the beginning of the season was the Rocky Mountain Cup. And we beat RSL this year. We lost to RSL this year. And we have a decider coming up in Commerce City on July 20th, which I can't be more excited about. And selfishly, Cole Bassick not making the Olympics means that our roster is going to be a little bit more strong for that.
Yeah.
And him and Diego Luna's revenge trains are going to come head-to-head on July 20th, which I'm very excited about. I think we're going to wrap up the show today. Emily, thank you so much. Mateus, thank you so much, even though your Wi-Fi pooped out 2 minutes in and you left. And Jeff, sincerely, thank you so much for joining. The Athletic needs to have you on more podcasts, so it's lovely to hear you talk about soccer for an hour.
So thoughtful.
Thank you all for listening, and peace.
Peace.
Take your shirt off.